Hey guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. So I'm back today with another GCSE video on migration. And this is carrying on straight from where we left off in the last video, and we're going straight back into America. And we're going to be looking today at some of the later points on America that you need to know, such as slavery, such as why people went there, why did they leave Britain, and going into the War of Independence. Now, a couple of things I want to say at the start. So I make these videos to try and help as many people as possible. So it's really important and it's really helpful for me if you can, leave comments about whether this is the kind of thing that you need that is helpful to you, or alternatively, what other things are useful. Where people leave comments, it means it gives me ideas that I can take and I can really kind of fly with, and I can go and make those videos so they're actually useful to individuals like you out there. Very quickly before we start, I want to again mention the Instagram that I am kind of setting up and using at the moment. It's got loads of bite-sized, useful things in there that hopefully you might find helpful, such as, what am I doing? Such as, how would I revise? Tips on revision. How would I get a grade 9 in something? What grade 9 ideas are out there? Things like that. So hopefully really helpful. History Revision Success, go and have a look. Now, getting straight into it. So slavery. You don't need to know a huge amount about slavery for this course on migration, but it is useful to know about the slave trade triangle, which occurred between Britain, Africa, and North America, including the West Indies, which today we call the Caribbean. This was a three-part journey where ships would leave Great Britain, filled often with trading items such as guns or rum or textiles, and it would take those items to Africa, where they would often trade those items for people. Then the ships laden with people would sail across the Atlantic in that very treacherous, awful journey, the Middle Passage, and they would go over to the West Indies and into North America, where they would then sell the slaves for money, which they could use the money to then buy goods such as molasses, sugar, raw materials, cotton, all those items which we learned that the North American colonies were creating, were producing, and they can take those items back to Great Britain. Those raw goods in Great Britain are then processed in factories, British jobs obviously being benefited by that, factories having big contracts to produce clothing or cloth from cotton, etc. And then those goods are taken back to America and sold at a higher price with high import taxes. So you can see, one, how slavery was extremely profitable for the Great British Empire, in particularly Great Britain. Second, how awful and terrible it must have been for the people involved. And third, why North American people by the mid-1700s might be feeling quite frustrated and resentful about this process. They're having their goods taken from them, brought back, and being forced to pay substantially higher prices for the manufactured product. And that's essentially the economic workings of slavery. So in terms of summarizing that economic impact, we went through this in the last video, so very quickly I'm putting that back on the screen, but you can see here all of the individuals who are going to profit from slavery. It was not just, the rich men who owned plantations. Lots and lots of ordinary people benefited from slavery by being employed in factories that made guns, or factories that processed raw materials, or more obviously factories that made chains or made parts of ships, etc. Those people were not profiting as such. They were obviously getting a wage, getting employment, but I guess the greater burden of blame does fall on people who were substantially benefiting from this process. Factory owners, ports, ship owners, bankers, all those people who were able to financially profit really from the action of slavery. Now, even more so, we have some very kind of high profile individuals who benefited from slavery and really pushed it going in that first instance by making substantial loans in order to get the workings off the ground. Now, one of those people was Queen Elizabeth, and the other one was King Charles II. So Queen Elizabeth was the first business partner of John Hawkins, who we called essentially the father of slavery in Great Britain. He was the first British man to be a slave trader. And she lent John Hawkins money, she invested in his program, and she reaped huge financial rewards from that. Now, King Charles, a couple of generations later, was a partner in the Royal African Company, which transported 60,000 slaves from Africa between 1680 and 1688. Many slaves were actually branded with DY after his brother, James, Duke of York. So you can see the very kind of integral role that even our monarchy has played in the economics of slavery. So slavery overall was one of the richest industries Britain had, and it made £60 million between 1769 and 1808. It also had a significant social impact. We had West Coast towns and ports such as Liverpool and Glasgow and Bristol growing into large cities during the 18th century as they benefited from the slave trade. Many of the fine buildings were built on profits. For example, Liverpool Town Hall, the National Portrait Gallery were all built on the profits of slavery. And Liverpool's mayors were slave traders, and so were many MPs in Parliament. Even into the 1800s, it was not illegal to make money from slavery. And this kind of emphasizes that lasting social belief that was held in Europe and, in I guess, Western countries, that Europeans were superior to Africans. And that's really where this kind of lasting legacy of racism first emerged from, those kind of social Darwinist ideas, which are absolutely wrong. Of course, we do not condone them at all. But that was what was driving this at the time, those false theories about race and superiority. Finally, by the late 1700s, we saw a campaign to end slavery. And in the migration course, you don't need to know about this apart from in a sentence, which I'll tell you in a second. If you're studying Power and the People, for which these videos are still very, very relevant, you do need to know in much more detail about the campaigners and the role of William Wilberforce, for example, the role of Equiano, and there's a couple of others in abolishing slavery. It's more of a focus of your course. So for people doing migration, we see 1807 and 1833, the abolition of slavery, two separate laws, one that abolished the buying and selling of slaves, and the second one that abolished the owning of slaves in the British Empire. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that, as we're about to see, America becomes independent and is not actually bound by the British Empire's rules. So at that point, it was actually later on when Lincoln abolishes slavery in America after the American Civil War. So just bear that in mind. Anyway, why did people go to America? So the next thing that you need to know for the America part of the module is why people went. So obviously we're going to start with, well, we're going to go through push and pull essentially. So push reasons to leave Britain. Unemployment was very, very high among farmhands and labourers in particular, and wages were very low in England. People struggled to survive and sometimes faced starvation. So there's an economic reason why people wanted to leave. Throughout the Tudor period, we'd seen the mid-Tudor crisis. We have had years of unprecedented poverty. Harvests were very, very poor, droughts, problems with the environment that were then causing unprecedented poverty from the people. We also have a shift in the economy, moving away from more traditional economies, moving towards newer economies, wool, sheep, etc. And that was causing some conflict. We also have the issue of enclosure, where the wealthier people were enclosing common land and taking that from the common people for themselves. Common land previously had been land where you could graze your one sheep or your one cow that you had. You didn't need to own your own land to graze that one animal on, or that couple of animals on. You could use the common land, but that land was being taken by the wealthier members of the society, of the community. It was being enclosed with fences. That was one of the biggest issues and causes of friction across kind of the Tudor period going into the Stuarts. And all of that has created this situation where we've got kind of widespread unemployment and poverty from the working classes in Britain. We also have some religious causes. So the Puritans, Quakers, and Catholics have all suffered persecution in Britain ever since Henry VIII changed the religion in England in the 1530s, 1534, the Act of Supremacy to be very precise. So under different governments, different groups have been persecuted. Catholics have been persecuted under Elizabeth I, particularly from the mid to end of her reign. It becomes far more difficult to be a Catholic. Under Cromwell and the Protectorate, we have a Puritan government, strictly Puritan, who also persecuted Catholics. And moving on, we become Anglican. And so Puritans face persecution then. So it's all quite complicated in terms of religion, but we've got different groups over time who are struggling to fit in to the mainstream accepted faith and mainstream accepted society. So those are the people who are choosing to leave and go to America to have religious freedom and to create their own communities in the way they want. And that would be a religious cause. And just so you know, 80,000 Puritans migrated to America between 1630 and 1641. So a significant number of people left because of this reason. Now, in addition, as I mentioned before, emigration peaked during the Civil War because of those religious difficulties in England, Puritan parliament, a king who kind of associated himself with Catholicism to some degree, and we have religion at the heart of that Civil War, at the heart of that conflict. So why do people choose America? What are the pull reasons to America? Well, one reason is that America was very rich in resources. For example, I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. You don't necessarily need to learn all of them, but you should learn, particularly if you want a grade 9 or a high grade, a couple of these very specific examples to quote in your essays. So Massachusetts and New Hampshire had milk, cod, cheese, potatoes, and eggs. New York, Maryland, Delaware, wheat, barley, oats, corn, and North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, the more southern states, we've got rice, tobacco, and cotton. Okay, so remember some of those specific resources that you could get in certain locations. Now, in addition, there was a vast expanse of free land in North America. Britain was overcrowded. Towns and cities, we've had migration, urbanization, movement to the cities, and they've become overcrowded. In comparison, in America, there were vast expanses of free land, new land available. So it was very promising to settlers who thought, you know, I can go and live this rich life with this huge farm, this huge land that I can have for myself. Moving into what was the experience actually like if you were a settler in America. So life was not easy. There was significant hardship and failure. Remember, you have to move to a place where there's absolutely nothing and create your own infrastructure. You have no doctors, no hospitals, you have no buildings, you have no farms, you have no way of getting food unless you find it or you can plant it. So it was a huge sacrifice to go and be one of the early settlers. You had to create this colony, you have to create your own rules, your own systems, your own way of living. And it was very, very difficult. And in many instances, actually, it didn't work. And if you know the story of Roanoke, which I think I went through in a previous video, you will know that in that case, for example, it didn't work, unfortunately, for those involved. Over time, however, they were successful in developing the 13 colonies. And Raleigh Sir Walter Raleigh, who first kind of got the permission from Elizabeth to go and find new lands, is known as the father of the American colonies for establishing the first colony of Roanoke in 1584. So your course now goes into two small kind of case studies as such, just to go through two examples of places in America where people settled. So the first being Virginia. So in 1601, King James I gave permission for a group of businessmen to sail to Virginia and establish Jamestown, which was founded in 1607. Unfortunately for them, they arrived too late to plant crops, so had to rely on native tribes to provide them with food. And there was also examples of massacre of early settlers by these kind of native communities, not placing blame here, obviously, because we have a very difficult situation where we've got people who've lived there all of their lives for generations. People are moving in and causing huge tensions, and we have massacres occurring on both sides of the spectrum. In this case, the settlers of Virginia were evident to have been killed by some of the locals that lived there. Wealthy aristocrats who also went out on this journey were not used to doing farm work. So you went out thinking, I'm going to be rich, I'm going to have this great life, and you have to do incredible amounts of farm work, manual labor to get this community started. They weren't used to it, but they had to do it, and that's why life was very, very difficult. In addition, a lot of these early movements took far too many men and not enough women, which is all well and good until you realize the fact that this is your community and you need to obviously keep life going. And so that was one of the big problems with Roanoke, for example. They didn't take enough women. Now, the other one you need to know about is Massachusetts, which was one of the most famous groups to arrive in 1620 on the Mayflower. This is the one that American people often remember and kind of celebrate. Now, they were mainly Puritans, and they set up a colony in New Plymouth. Enough survived the winter with help from local tribes for it to become a permanent colony, and they became known as the Pilgrim Fathers. They managed to create a religious and democratic system with rules and traditions that would become the foundation of the American identity. And Thanksgiving tradition dates back to a feast held by some of the Pilgrims in 1621. So if you're looking at significance there, and you're thinking about that particular question, the fact that Americans to this day still celebrate Thanksgiving dates back to those Puritan settlers, the Puritan fathers, all the way back in 1620. Now, we do need to look at the impact British colonies had on Native Americans. So Native tribes had been there long before Europeans. That's obviously very, very important to know. Many tribes had many different cultures, and they all existed in kind of a migratory way of life. And this is very useful to know for your significance question again, which is why I've highlighted that for you up there. So we have native tribes living in migratory groups, in different groups with different cultures, different traditions, rather than one kind of homogenous society. You need to make sure you've got that clear in your head. Now, they would have seen They would have seen the British as invaders who took territory by force and wiped out several tribes, passing on disease, passing on illnesses that the locals in America were not used to. Their bodies did not have the antibodies or the bacterium to fight these new Western European diseases, okay? That's why when you go on holiday, if you're going on holiday to somewhere very different with a very different climate or very different diseases, you have to have you have to have jabs, don't you? You go and you have to have special jabs or special injections to protect you from illnesses, diseases which your body cannot fight. So it's kind of a contrast of invasion and colonization from the British. Now, relationships were varied between local communities and the settlers. For example, in Jamestown and New Plymouth, there were examples of good relations and also of bad relations. In particular, the British had good relations with a tribe called the Powhatan, which is the tribe that Pocahontas came from. If you know the famous story, I've actually got a video on here about Pocahontas and about her true life story and who she actually was and how Disney kind of dramatized her life slightly. Who did she really marry? How did she really die? Things like that. So go and have a look at that if you're interested. But overall, the British had a significant impact on Native American livelihood. In 1500, there were 560,000 Native Americans in British territory, or the territory that the British were going to claim for themselves. And by 1700, there were almost half, 280,000. Diseases such as measles and smallpox, bad treatment of natives by the British, and British consistent expansion of territory into their migratory lands where they graze their cattle, things like that, caused huge problems for the longevity of these communities. Now, if you're thinking about significance, and in particular long-term significance, the idea that today the Native American population of America is only 0.7%, I think is significant. You can talk about how this has led to the long-term destruction of their way of life. You could also talk about how lots of communities still live on the reservations they were forced onto by the British, and you can use that as a long-term significance point. Thank you very much, guys, for listening today. I've got one more video coming your way on America, where I'm going to focus on the War of Independence, the causes of it, the events of it, and the significance of the whole thing, so you can answer that significance question. And if this video gets enough interest, if these videos are getting enough interest, I'll continue with the migration series. Otherwise, I might move on, do something else, or look at Power and the People again. I just really need the indication from you. What's helpful? What do you need? What subjects, topics are you studying? History is very unique in that sense, where you can all be taking the GCSE, but all doing very different things. So what I create is dependent on what you're going to watch. So please do, like, comment if you want me to keep going with this and doing more, because I could go through the whole of the migration topic, video by video, covering everything, so you have all that revision material, or I could just move on and do something else if that's more useful for other people. So there we go. Please do subscribe. It really supports me, and it means hopefully I'll be able to continue doing these videos and putting them out there for free for you. So yeah, I would really appreciate that support.